My name is Maria Muzaffar. I am convening this with these brilliant partners with me and welcoming the nation to speak about policy issues relating to religious liberties. I want to first of all say this to you as we begin. They say that you are in the wrong room if you're the smartest person in the room. So, everybody that is joining us tonight, I want to tell you, you are in the right room. We have brilliant people here, and I'm excited to get started. I want to first say that this specific meeting, this specific town hall, has been open for the nation because we want all of you to hear and learn about the different faith communities across the nation. But I also want to make sure, all of us together, that we allow the ability for elected officials to know what was said. And so we're going to record this whole town hall. We have invited elected officials to come and listen, pop in and out, take notes, know what the faith communities are saying and thinking. But we are going to ensure that the recording of this Zoom link is going to be sent to every inbox for an elected official in Congress. So if you are tuning in and you have congressional relationships with congressional members, you might want to drop them a link tomorrow morning or this evening and say, I watched something great. I'd love for you to see it. We want to have we want to make sure that there are no gaps between what we say and the information and the access road to get the information to the elected official. And I think that's very, very important. And why are we doing this? Why do we have faith communities here together? Because many faith communities, when we're watching executive orders and policies being handed down, sometimes all of us think back and say, who did they talk to about this? Where did they get their information? Who were the experts in the room? So we want to make sure that we have experts in the room. So that's why it's so important. And I think also in a time where faith communities are either being sidelined, mischaracterized, or weaponized, it's so important to center faith community voices because the founding of this country was made by people who are looking for religious freedom. Faith is very essential to the identity of this nation, but it's also very essential for faith communities to be able to advocate and represent who they are without fear. A fundamental belief in our democracy is the First Amendment. So all of us today are committed to the First Amendment. But most importantly, we want to show a model of civil discourse in this nation at a time when we see dehumanizing political rhetoric and political violence throughout our nation. I'll say this. Unfortunately, we saw a lot of cases that really, really shook our soul in this last year. And I think that what it reminds us that we are connected through our humanity. In San Diego, there was a shooting at an Islamic center. And I believe that 5-year-old girl that wears a hijab, that is Muslim, that was led out by her kindergarten teacher to a place that was safer, received a message for a lifetime. And the message she received is that somebody could come in your safest space and want to shoot you for who you are. What's equally as tragic is that the individual who perpetrated that crime was only 17. And then he shot himself. Equally as tragic. And so we are living in a time in our country where people hate themselves so much that their life is worthless, and they could have that hate internalized so much that it could be targeted towards someone else. And I don't know about all of you, but I can sense definitely from the panelists is that we have to have a different model for our coming generation. And that's why it's so important for us to have this civil discourse and offer it, not only to the younger generation, but to everybody else that shares this space in this great country. So welcome, and let us begin. Let me start out with introducing Miss Megan Goodwin. And we're waiting for Miss Megan Goodwin. Here we go. Welcome, Miss Megan Goodwin. And I think we have another slide that is supposed to come and be shared here. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So Miss Megan Goodwin is here. Is there a way, I just want to make sure for our audience that we're able to see Miss Megan Goodwin and myself and the bio. I think what we will do is this. This is the beautiful thing about a virtual town hall. So we've seen the bio here. So let's now remove the bio, and I would love to get back to Megan. Okay. All right. So thank you for joining us, and I appreciate your time. If you could please introduce yourself in a sentence or two and answer for me the following question. What are the fundamental policy priorities of the Catholic community right now in this moment in 2026?
Well, hi, Maria. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this National Town Hall to speak about the very core importance of religious liberties across a pluralistic democracy. So to introduce myself briefly, my name is Megan Goodwin. I'm a senior policy professional, government relations professional. I've worked for the institutional Catholic Church for over a decade. I'm currently finishing up my PhD with a focus on Catholicism and democracy. Happy to be here. And in terms of the core policy priorities of the Catholic Church, so this is how does the Catholic faith intersect into the space of ethics and public life. And for the 119th Congress, there are 4 buckets of those policy priorities. The first is to support and strengthen families by providing meaningful support for pregnant mothers, parents, and their children, so that every family has the support to choose life for their baby, enacting protections for the preborn, enhancing the child tax credit to help families flourish, and allowing parents to choose the best education for their children or school choice. The second bucket is to protect the poor and vulnerable at home and abroad, such as by maintaining social safety net programs like Medicaid or SNAP that provide life-changing and life-saving support for those in need. Ensuring that tax reform makes poor families better off and not worse, providing essential assistance to our most vulnerable brothers and sisters struggling in the most dire conditions around the world, and ensuring good environmental stewardship. So families, protect the poor and vulnerable. The third bucket is to support an immigration system that furthers the common good with targeted, proportionate, and humane immigration enforcement that safeguards our borders and communities, while providing legal pathways to immigrants, respect for due process, access to humanitarian protections such as refugee resettlement, and compassion to people who are on the move, and accommodations for family unity. And finally, one of the 4 core policy interactions is to defend religious liberty by protecting faith communities around the world from discrimination and respecting the religious nature of faith providers' charitable and social service work.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Goodwin. I just want to clarify one question. A follow-up question, really. With the 4 priorities, is there a methodology that your community, the Catholic community, is able to communicate with members of Congress? Is there a process that you take to make sure that they know what your policies are?
Certainly. So what my role was I was Associate Director for Government Relations. There's a Government Relations Office at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I also worked in Government Relations for Catholic Relief Services on global health and climate change. And so the responsibility of these Government Relations offices is to take these policy priorities first and foremost and bring them to the Hill, bring them to Capitol Hill. Visit with members of Congress. We send it by email. We follow up with visits. We do introductions every new Congress, along with Catholic Charities and Catholic Relief Services, to outline these core priorities. And then as the legislative session progresses and concrete legislative proposals come forward, those are assessed in light of these moral principles, and then determinations are made. We might say, this proposed legislation cuts SNAP by this amount. Here's what our social service providers see on the ground. Here's why we would recommend that you not do that, or you make it more efficient in these other ways. And so there's a whole apparatus in these Catholic institutions to be the ones who are messengers to lawmakers, to public servants about the Catholic perspective insofar as it intersects with the common good.
Thank you. And that's very useful information for other faith communities too, the process that you take on. Can I have Ms. Tuka Nusayrat join me, please?
Hello, Salam Maria.
Assalamu alaikum. How are you, Ms. Tuka?
I'm doing well.
So if you could introduce yourself in about 2 sentences. And my question to you is, there's so many questions about the fact that the Muslims are coming, I'm interested in knowing, what is the demographic of the Muslim community?
Mhm. Yes. Well, thank you for hosting this. I'm the executive director at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, also known as ISPU, where we conduct research on American Muslims through polling, surveys, and other research methods. And we have done a poll called the American Muslim Poll most recently, late last year. And it reveals a lot about the demographics of American Muslims as compared to other faith groups in the United States and the general public. And it's really important to situate American Muslims in the diverse community that we have here in the United States. There's a lot of misconceptions about American Muslims, and we hope that this research and data can clarify some of those misinformation, disinformation. So our data shows that American Muslims are the youngest and the most racially diverse faith community in the United States. So there's no single ethnic or racial majority in the American Muslim community. 28% identify themselves as Black or African American, 24% as Asian, 20% as white, 12% as Arab, and 9% as Hispanic, with the remainder being mixed race, some Native American, or other backgrounds. And when I said youngest, what I mean by that is that 1 in 4 American Muslims is between the ages of 18 to 24, which is a much larger share of young people than other faith groups that we measure. So that has a number of implications that we discuss in our report. But one other aspect of American Muslims is that faith is very central to their daily lives. So across age and racial group, 89% of American Muslims say that religion is very important to them. And that's like one of the highest percentages among faith groups in the United States. And that holds steady whether they are young or old. They're also very engaged citizens. We found in our latest survey that 85% of American Muslims are registered to vote, which is a jump of 25% from 2016 when we first started asking this question. And Muslims are contacting their federal representatives at higher rates than the general public. So this picture is of a community that is young, that is devout, that is deeply diverse and civically engaged. And it doesn't map on very neatly to any single, racial or political category. And that's why religious liberty protections matter so much to our community.
Thank you, Tuka. Thank you so much. Rabbi Andrea London.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for joining us, Rabbi. What are the fundamentals of the Jewish faith and the demographics of the Jewish community?
Thank you very much, Maria, for having me on. Shalom Aleichem. I serve a congregation in Evanston, Illinois, where I've been for the last 26 years. The fundamentals of the Jewish faith, I would say, are that we believe we have a covenantal relationship with God, that began, as we understand, when we approached Mount Sinai after our exodus from Egypt. And there we received the Torah, the law. And when we accepted that, we accept being in this relationship with God that means uplifting and upholding our what we call the mitzvot, the sacred obligations that God has given to us. And those obligations are ritual, and they are also moral and ethical obligations. At the end of every prayer service, we say these words, that our responsibility is to repair the world in order to make this world a place where God's presence is fully experienced, and we feel the mercy of God. And in order to do that, we believe that we have sacred obligations to do what God has instructed us to do in this world. And as I said, those are both ritual and moral. That's in a nutshell, the important parts of what we need to do. And then there's lots of details. As we say, that there was a rabbi who was approached a couple of thousand years ago, and he was asked to say, what does Judaism say? And he said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You shall not do anything that will harm another person. All the rest is commentary. Go and learn it.
Thank you. What are the demographics of the Jewish community in the United States? However you'd like to define demographics is up to you.
Jewish community in the United States, I think that we're at about 6.5 million Jews in the United States, clustered in the large cities primarily. So places like Chicago and New York and Los Angeles and those kinds of big cities, not as many Jews in the rural areas. In fact, there had been Jews scattered in many other places, and many of those small communities of Jews do not really exist anymore. They continue to gather. I don't know the demographics in terms of the age of our community. I think that we're across the board in terms of age. We tend to skew more European of origin, but not certainly entirely so. And the community is becoming more diverse as everywhere in our country, people are marrying people who are of different ethnic backgrounds and joining the community. And people are also converting into Judaism, and so certainly the percentage of people who are ethnically diverse has increased over the years. In terms of like our religious observance, about 15% of our community would be what we consider Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, and about 85% would be considered more on the liberal spectrum of conservative, Reform, Constructionists, and other denominations that there's many other smaller denominations as well. And so we tend to be much more liberal as a community. There's also many people who consider themselves to be Jewish, who not necessarily subscribe to one denomination or another, but see themselves as ethnically Jewish, familially Jewish, part of Jewish peoplehood, and that's more important than their religious observance. What I think that Robert Putnam and others have called the nones, Nones, that they and that is a growing number. People who still consider themselves to be Jewish, but not necessarily to be so affiliated with a religious observance. Religious observance.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Dr. Raja Bhatter, if you could join me, please.
Good afternoon.
Good evening from where I am, but good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us. There's so much that everybody is learning today. I wanted to ask you, you prescribe to the Hindu faith. What are the fundamentals of the Hindu faith and the demographics of the Hindu community in the United States?
Sure. I think we need more than 2 minutes, but we're going to try to wrap up as much as possible. I think Hinduism in general is such a diverse, complicated set of communities and practices that it's hard to say this is what we believe, because we are one of the most pluralistic traditions that are kind of the amalgamation of so many different regional and cultural diversities, both within South Asia and the diaspora. But typically, some of the foundational values of Hinduism tend to be this focus on karma, and that our actions lead to consequences, and that our consequences define where and how we show up in life in various aspects of the world. Typically, then we believe there's a soul, that all human beings and all animals, all plants, we have this thing called Atman, which is a soul, and that part of the purpose of human existence is to evolve spiritually and to evolve together as communities so that we're able to help become better with each lifetime. So we believe in reincarnation as a source of doing that. And through living through all the ups and downs of life, we consider this the samsara, which is kind of the ocean of life, that navigating and wading through life and the various journeys that come along help us get to clarify our true purpose of soul and existence in the world. Typically, the four purposes of human existence are called the Purusharthas. They're the purpose of human existence, literally, Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. Dharma says purposeful living, that we all have a purpose in life, and our goal on earth is to experience and understand and live that to the fullest of our ability. And that can change based on community, identity, etc. Artha means, well, to say maybe have resources to live together. We have all things to be comfortable and joyful in life. Then Kama is love and desire. Community is really important, to say, how do we find community as a source of liberation? And then finally, spiritual growth, or moksha, which is liberation, to say, how do we evolve from one spiritual consciousness to the next, so that through each lifetime we become better versions of ourselves. A lot of this stuff comes from our major spiritual texts, mostly the Vedas, which are about 4,000 to 7,000 years old. The oldest version of them, at least, that talk about both the rituals and the practices and philosophies and various ways that we understand social cultural organizations and practices, along with other various texts. There's various ways to understand the divine. One of our main important mantras is Ekam Sat Vipraha Bahuda Vadanti. That says that there's one truth, but the divine sages see it in many forms. And so that God is seen as almost like a lake of water, and that there's different paths to the water, but the water is still the same. So we all have a purpose, kind of finding our own path to this space. I'll stop
Beautiful.
there. Yeah.
Beautiful. No, beautiful. And I'm very impressed that you were able to do that in such a short amount of time. If I could ask you one question, if you could, I don't know if you want to answer a statistic. What is the percentage? I guess the number for the Hindu community.
I'd love to. Yeah, there's about 1%, about 3.6 million folks who are Hindu identified in the US, mostly come from first and second generation immigrants, mostly from the post 1965, when the Immigration Acts that excluded Asians were lifted. Before that, there's some Hindu communities and Sikh communities that existed in the late 1800s and 1900s across kind of South Asia, across the US, I'm sorry. But most of our of Hindus have come from India, Caribbean, Eastern Africa, Southeast Asia, and really came over because of targeted recruitment due to STEM and immigration policies that shifted that time.
Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, please.
Add one more piece. Part of the challenge is also thinking about the ways that so much of the immigration happened mostly among upper class, upper caste Brahmins. And so the role of casteism also plays a huge role in who were allowed to come over to the US and how that shaped kind of Hindu American politics as well, and how that led to some of the nationalistic initiatives that we're seeing now, and some of the ways that we are still navigating as a diverse community in a diasporic experience, how we make sense of who we are, how we exist, and how we take up political and cultural space to be intentional and inclusive in this pluralistic world that we live in.
And we will get into some of the things that you had stated about the nationalistic as well. So we'll get into that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Could I please invite Ms. Kiran Gill to join me?
Sure. Yes, it's great to be here.
How are you, Kiran? Ms. Kiran
Doing
Gill.
well, doing well. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. You're from the Sikh community. Is the pronunciation Sikh or Sikh?
It's actually Sikh.
Sikh. Okay, so you're from the Sikh community. What are the fundamental beliefs of the Sikh faith?
Well, I think the Sikh faith can actually be summed up by one word, which is the start of our Bani or our prayers, and that is ik. And it's this idea that we are all one. And we believe, we say we're part of a monotheistic tradition, but we don't believe in a personified type of God. We believe that God is everywhere and everything. And it's essentially a life force. And it's through our meditation on God that we can achieve spiritual liberation. My 2-year-old daughter's name is a Junie, and that's also one of the words in our Gurbani, in our scripture. And we were trying to explain in English what that meant. And we translated initially as beyond life. And somebody said that sounded like Buzz Lightyear from one of the movies. But the way we then started translating it, because essentially the goal of Nam Japo, of saying Vaiguru's name, is to achieve that spiritual liberation. And so that's how we ended up translating it, which I think is a more accurate translation. The other fundamental, there's a couple of fundamentals in the Sikh faith. It was started in the 1600s by Guru Nanak. And in many ways, he was a social justice pioneer. So one of the big issues and that time that he stood up and fought against was the caste system. And he really wanted to reimagine a world where we were all equal, we were all one, and we were afforded and treated with the same dignity and respect. And we see that oneness in one another. And I think that really guides, the Sikh faith and the practice. We have something called langar, which is part of our tradition, where everybody sits and eats on the floor and eats a meal that's served all by volunteers. And that signifies this idea that we're all equal, that we are all one, and we're part of the same, entity. We're part of the same life force, Vaheguru. And Vaheguru itself, Va means awe, wonder. And that's what we feel when we are connected to Vaheguru. We feel awe, we feel wonder. The word Sikh actually means to learn. So we consider ourselves students of Sikhi, of the religion, of understanding how to reach that spiritual liberation. But what I think Sikhs are probably most known for is we're also a visible religious minority, specifically here in the United States. We have 5 articles of faith, which helps us achieve the discipline to go forth and achieve the spiritual liberation. So one of them is they're called the 5 gaze. So we have gaze, which is uncut hair, which signifies spirituality. We have Ganga, which is a comb, which signifies cleanliness and order. We have Kashera, which is undershorts, which signifies discipline. We have the kara, which is a steel bracelet. It's worn on the dominant hand, and it's a reminder to do what's right in your actions. And then finally, the kirpan, which is a small dagger, small sword, which is a reminder to stand up for justice and stand up for the oppressed. So those are also themes in Sikhi. And just like in many other religions, we have tenets, Nam Japo, Varnchako, and Kirta Karo, which is a sort of summary of the religion. Remember God, share with others, and work, do an honest living, work hard and achieve an honest living. So I think those are some of the tenets of the religion that really define who Sikhs are and how we practice.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And as we continue the town hall, we wanted to start out with this introductions of all the faiths. I know that the Muslim community, we had demographics. We'll work in the fundamentals of the faiths a little bit later down in that town hall. When we get to that question, we'll work that in. But this was a beautiful introduction, and thank you so much for doing that, introducing it to us. I want to now invite former Congresswoman Marie Newman to join me, because I have a specific question for you, Ms. Marie Newman. So we heard about all the different, thank you for joining us. So we heard about all the different faiths that are with us today, and there's many more in our nation as well. How do you interpret the Establishment Clause and the freedom of religion in our nation?
Maria, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to all my co-panelists. What an amazing crew tonight. So thank you all for your great work individually and together. This is a really important conversation tonight, right? Because we are a country that is free to practice our faiths or not practice faith if we wish, right? And the Constitution is crystal clear. There is no interpretation here. It is just a fact. So, in the Establishment Clause, it's the first 16 words of the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And so what this does, it's really clear, is that it prevents the government from establishing a national religion or endorsing a particular faith or unduly favoring religion over non-religion or any specific religion or non-religion. So the clause is really crystal clear. There's no other way to interpret it. And what this does very effectively is that it says, hey, guys, no official state religion. And remember, our founders ran away from countries that were requiring one specific religion be adhered to, and that there's no favoritism, and that there is no religious coercion, there's no bullying, there's no recruitment, there's no, that you simply, all of these good people on this panel and similar folks like them can go to their place of worship and worship if they so choose. They can pray anywhere they want. You just can't have an official state religion, no favoritism, and no coercion. It's just really simple.
And so when you say that about the founders, what is the argument, though, when it's challenged that the intent of the founders is a Judeo-Christian identity? Where does that foundation come from?
So I want to see the facts around that, right? There is no, so if you were to talk to major historians, whether it was John Meacham, Stephen Beschloss, Michael Beschloss, anybody, any major historian is never going to be able to produce a document, a letter amongst the founders that said, hey guys, let's do the secret handshake, and that it's really a Judeo-Christian country. There's just nothing like that. There's nothing to support that. So while the founders supported all religion and however you want to, in fact, practice faith is great, right? But I'll give you a couple examples. President Washington, and when he was a general, used to say in public, I am not of religion. And that was a way of saying that publicly he was sort of agnostic. He was a faithful Episcopalian, to be clear, but when he was in public, so his troops, when he was a general, and his partners in government never thought that he was going to bring that into the equation to force it on them. And I think that was brilliant leader. And remember, he was independent because we were prior to parties. And then similarly, Madison, Jefferson, George Mason, all pushed the Bill of Rights, right? They created the Bill of Rights where it's very clear that you have religious freedom in this country.
I mean, that is the biggest example of the intent, actually, the Bill of Rights.
Right.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to bring you back for another question. But what I wanted to do is also invite Ms. Janae Lewis to chime in here on this specific question.
Yes, there I am. Hello.
Ms.
Good
Janae
evening.
Lewis. Hi. So, Ms. Marie Newman touched on this a little bit, and I don't know why my camera is no longer on, but okay, I should be hopping
I
out.
can hear you, though. I can hear you.
Okay, so I think it's interesting that. Hold on, just a second. I'm back. Okay, you can hear me.
Yeah.
So my question, until you can see me, is what about this movement within some of these policies that we're seeing about Christianity first? That not just that the founders had a Judeo-Christian intent, but that we want to implement policies where we make America tied with Christianity first. What is your opinion on that? And I believe, if I may ask, you are of the Catholic faith. Is that correct? Okay, yeah, I would love to hear your viewpoint on that.
Yes, thank you, Maria. So yes, I am Roman Catholic. I'm also the CEO of Faith and Public Life, which is an interfaith organization working with leaders around the country to do education and advocacy for a more equitable society where everyone can thrive. And I 100% agree with Ms. Marie Newman with what is written in the Constitution and the founders. And I think part of the dissonance we see right now in our society is because there's an idea of supremacy that is also encoded in the founding of our country. So we have to remember that the founding fathers imagined and asserted that citizens who would then have access to the rights in the Constitution were white land-owning men. And that is not written in the Constitution, but I think when we're looking at imagination and intent, I do believe that some of the founding fathers had a more expansive hope for the country. But at the time, as they were constructing these rights, the rights were granted to white landowning men. And that is a supremacist mindset, meaning that white landowning men are somehow more worthy or more deserving of these rights than other people who may be present in the country, including enslaved people, of whom I'm a descendant, and including Native Americans who were here first. So when we listen to our faith traditions, as we've heard, with all of the values about dignity of all human beings, the potential and opportunity for all human beings to access the divine, we hear these themes very clearly across all of our religions. That was not necessarily encoded in our Constitution. So what we have now is a continuation of the supremacist ideas that were at our founding, and they are encoded in Christian language. The idea that we should be a Christian first nation is not Christian. There's no justification for it in our scripture. There's no justification for it written in the Constitution, but it is similar to the idea that the rights that were encoded at the founding of our country were only accessible by some people. And now this idea that only some people practicing a certain flavor of Christianity would then be able to have all of the rights and access in our country. The last thing that I'll say as a Catholic, I think it's really important to understand that even though you may see some Catholics asserting this Christian first ideal, there are many Christians in our government. There are many Christian denominations who do not believe that Catholics are really Christian. I've had this debate many times in my life. And there is teaching that says to some Protestant denominations that unless you are born again or unless you worship or believe in a very particular way, you are not truly a follower of Christ. You will not get to heaven. And those denominations do believe that Catholics are not really Christian. So again, there's a supremacist flavor that is deeply a part of the culture of the United States that I believe is leading to some of what we're saying with Christian first rhetoric, as well as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
Thank you, Janae. And I just want to say this to expand this a little bit, and we'll have a person from the Christian community next time. But I would say this, that just like you were saying, that a lot of Catholics you'll see are not promoting a Christian first. A lot of Christians are not promoting a Christian first either, right? And so I think that needs to be clarified too, that they agree with what you're saying. A lot of Christians, majority of Christians agree with what you're saying. What Congresswoman Marie Newman is saying is as well, is that the identity of being Christian is not tied to the fact that you have to have your government attached to Christian first, which is very important to know. And why it's so important for these nuances, because we only get sound bites and headlines to divide faith groups. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, to clarify, Roman Catholics are Christians.
Right.
So Christians encompass Catholics and Protestants. And so what I hear you saying, which is true, is that the vast majority of Christians, the vast majority of Catholics, the vast majority of Protestants in the United States do not believe that we should be a Christian first nation. Religious freedom is one of the most popular ideals still present in the United States of America, including from among Christians. But there is a faction of Christians who are promoting this ideology, which is not based in our country's founding, nor is it based in our religion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to invite Mr. Edward Mitchell, please. to join me. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, Brother Edward Mitchell. So, we had a conversation about the Establishment Clause, and we had a conversation about this Christian First narrative. But really, from everything that you read with the headlines, the headlines show that actually Muslims are trying to violate the Establishment Clause because they are trying to implement Sharia into mainstream America. So it seems like we're only talking about the Christian First, but this critique that Muslims also want to do something like that is that something that you can respond to? And first of all, let's start out by first explaining what is Sharia, because I think that's probably also a big question that majority of the country may have.
Yeah. Thanks, Maria. So I'm Edward Ahmed Mitchell. I'm a civil rights attorney. I serve as the Deputy Director of CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is our nation's largest Muslim civil rights group. So our bread and butter is dealing with anti-Muslim hate, protecting the American Muslim community and our neighbors and our allies from bigotry and discrimination. And you're absolutely right. We currently live in a bizarre world where there are many people who claim that Muslims are the ones trying to impose religion on other people, which is obviously not the case. American Muslims, 6 million to 7 million of us, depending on which survey you look at, are just trying to live our lives. As you know, Maria, the fundamental beliefs of Islam are that there is no God except for God, who is one and has no partner and should be worshipped alone, and that his final prophet of mankind was the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. And Sharia, which is an Arabic word that essentially means the way or the path to water, refers to the rules of Islam, the rules that Muslims follow. It's analogous to canon law in Catholicism or halakha in Judaism. So when a Muslim prays 5 times a day, fasts in Ramadan, gives in charity, doesn't eat pork, doesn't drink alcohol, doesn't charge interest on debt, they're following the rules of Islam, the rules of Sharia. Many scholars translate Sharia also as Islamic law. So the irony is when you hear anti-Muslim bigots saying Sharia law is going to take over, what they're saying doesn't make sense. It's like they're saying Islamic law. So this is nutty. It's a conspiracy theory. It makes no sense. It was once said about Catholics, 50 years ago, that Catholics were plotting to take over America and impose their religion on America, and they were loyal to the Pope and not to America. This is an old conspiracy theory, new century. Now, what I would say, though, is that if you look at Islamic law, there absolutely are aspects of Islamic law that relate to what a government would do. There are rules regarding taxation, criminal punishment, trade, family law. That is absolutely true, but only a state can uphold those laws. So if you were in a Muslim country, of course, you will find many Muslim countries that interpret and enforce Islamic law to some extent. Those rules have no application in this country because it's a secular country. Muslims are a minority here. So we are not trying and could not enforce those governmental aspects of Islamic law, just like Christians and Jews cannot enforce the religious aspects of their faith that involve governmental rules. And so what's really happening here, Maria, is that anti-Muslim bigots just hate Muslims. They do not like Muslims being in this country. They especially hate Muslims because of our advocacy for Palestinian human rights. And because they can't win an argument with us, they can't tell us that Palestinians aren't humans. They can't tell us that it's okay to send our tax dollars overseas to support genocide. They figure the best way to silence American Muslims is to smear us, to make people afraid of us. And this Sharia law nonsense, conspiracy theory is one of the ways they do that.
Thank you. So thank you for clarifying Sharia, and thank you for clarifying the position. We're going to actually have a discussion on the actual anti-Sharia caucus and Sharia hearings a little bit later. I would like to invite now Ms. Noreen Newman back for just 1 second, if she is here. I didn't see her.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. There we go. Okay. Now, just around this discussion up here, there is a movement on policy at the state level for 10 commandments in the classroom. So we just had a discussion about Establishment Clause. We had a discussion about where the Muslims stood on, what Catholics stood on it. So then the question is, where is the momentum coming from for something like 10 commandments in the classroom?
Well, it's coming from nowhere except for some extremist folks in our current GOP party. I'm just going to be honest with everybody. It's a very small group of people, and they're typically legislators that think they should speak for their faith, and they shouldn't. So to be clear, I'm Catholic and I don't want to see the Ten Commandments in schools. I'm a proud believer and acceptor in the Ten Commandments. I don't want them to be in schools. I don't want it to be taught to my children in public school. If you're a faith school, yeah, well, you should be teaching whatever
So,
your faith is.
yeah, that's what I just wanted to kind of tie here, especially for the audience, is that the question is, where is the inspiration coming from? But also that there's people who value the Ten Commandments deeply, have deep respect
Yeah.
for it. I think all faiths
Right.
here also have deep respect for it. But the question is, how do we protect democracy? And people are approaching it in different ways. So that's just the question I wanted to clarify. Okay, can I please invite Ms. Shadden Molly?
Salam
Assalamu
alaikum.
alaikum. Thank you for joining us, Shadden. If you could introduce yourself in 2 sentences, and I'm going to ask you a question then, please.
Sure. I am the Senior Director for MPAC, the Muslim Public Affairs Council. They're a national policy and advocacy organization that works to advance justice, equity, and inclusion for American Muslims.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. And my question was just to round up this Sharia conversation. So what we saw on the headlines, but everybody in the nation that was paying attention saw that there is an anti-Sharia caucus. A lot of people don't know about it, and we would love to learn about it, why it was formed, what's the motivation. And then there is an actually anti-Sharia hearings based on what Mr. Edward Mitchell said about the fact that there is no movement of the Muslim community trying to take Sharia. Why was there an anti-Sharia hearing, and your opinion on it generally?
So the person who formed it, his name is Congressman Chip Roy, and he held 2 hearings called Sharia Free America, and it's run by his 63-member caucus, and that is larger than the entire Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And this was in the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution. Not one Muslim was invited to testify, not one scholar of Islamic law. Instead, what they did is they platformed extremists from David Horowitz, Freedom Center, and Rare Foundation. One witness told Congress, word for word, that Islam offers every non-Muslim 3 choices. Quote, convert, submit, or die. And CARE, our dear advocacy organization, was branded a terror front on the congressional record during that same hearing. And this was personal for us, for the Muslim Public Affairs Council, because our staff in DC was in that room. And our vice president, Haris Sareen, was attacked online. He was called a terrorist. A man who served a decade at Homeland Security, and he ran the largest refugee resettlement effort in our nation's history. That is who they called a terrorist. So this rhetoric has a body count too, of course, because through our Center for Security, Technology, and Policy, we found attacks on Muslims and mosques surged 11-fold, ending in the fatal mosque shooting in San Diego just days ago. So what came out of the hearings, Mario? Nothing. No evidence. Even the Trump Justice Department closed its Dallas investigation and found nothing. Just a machine of bills to deny visas, deport, and bar people based on their faith. None have passed. None even reached a markup. So because here is the truth. Sharia means the path. And it's grounded in justice and equity for all. It's not a threat to the Constitution. It is a partner to it. So were these hearings useful? Only to us, because they exposed who is weaponizing Congress against the faith. And that is exactly why we cannot stay silent.
Thank you. Thank you, Shadden. That gives us a lot of clarification, and also in the future to understand the interplay of political sound bites and the momentum that you create, and how congressional hearings can be used. It's very valuable for the nation to hear how congressional hearings can be used by either side for their political initiatives. You spoke about political rhetoric that is dangerous. You called, a gentleman that somebody called him a terrorist online, and obviously that can result to violence as well. I want to really expand on that about hate crimes and political rhetoric and bullying as well, because I know it's touched the Muslim community, but what we don't necessarily hear all the time is that there's a community that many times gets identified as being Muslim and they're not Muslim, and they have hate crimes and bullying against them as well. So I'd just like to bring in Mr. Manjeet Singh, if he could join me to speak about the Sikh community.
Hello, Maria. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us this evening. So my question to you is, we just heard Mishad and Molly's statement, with very serious ramifications for our country, of what we are experiencing as a nation. Now, I know for a fact that there are many times that people from the Sikh community get identified as Muslim, and have there been cases where that's been the case, and how has the Sikh community responded? And then within the Sikh community, just for being Sikh and wearing the turban and having the beard, has there been a rise in hate crimes and bullying? And if there has been a rise, why do you think that occurs?
That's a great question. So definitely there is a lot of instances of hate crime and bullying. Often it is because of misidentification.
Mhm.
Often it is just pure ignorance, just because you look different, you're not white. People assume that you are an immigrant. There are Sikhs in this country that are fourth, fifth generation now. But the lack of awareness combined with the political rhetoric that is used to demonize the other is what causes all of these. So there's been, especially in an environment like we are facing now, there is a spike of incidents of hate crimes and bullying among, especially for children who are in school and middle school and high school. And the worst episodes or cases of hate crime and bullying happen in the aftermath of 9/11, and that continued for almost 10 years. It does subside, but then when you see the political rhetoric against immigrants, there is a spike again. There was a gentleman who was an elderly gentleman who was brutally attacked in downtown LA about 6 or 7 months ago. He was sitting at a bus stop waiting for the bus, and that was a hate crime. He was in a coma for several months. Fortunately, he is recovering. He came out of the coma. But these incidents are happening all the time. And the political environment is the primary kind of the catalyst for
You
the
mean the
violence.
political environment? You mean political rhetoric?
Yeah.
Rhetorical? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I just want to add this, that the reason why I wanted to ask this question about the Sikh community getting mistaken for the Muslim community, because from what I have seen, historically, the Sikh community has never made a grievance for this against the Muslim community. In fact, they have stood in alliance with it. And I think it's just a very important thing to highlight, that people of different faiths stand together because humanity is under attack. And I just wanted to bring highlight to that. So thank you for sharing that. I'd like Ms. Sravya Tadepali to join me, please. And you represent the Hindu community as well. Have you seen a rise in hate crimes and bullying as well in the Hindu community due to the recent political rhetoric that is being shared?
So we have seen a rise in hate crimes against the Hindu community, but I do think it's important to keep this in perspective. Obviously, one hate crime is a hate crime and it should be dealt with as a hate crime. But compared to Sikhs, Muslims, Jews, the Hindu community is not targeted to nearly the same level. So while we are seeing an increase in hate against our community, it's really important to note that we're not targeted quite at those same levels. And oftentimes when we are targeted, it is because we're perceived to be something else. We're perceived to be Muslim, or it's because of anti-Indian hate, incidents like these. And you might be aware of how in Frisco, Texas, there's a lot of hate violence and hate speech being targeted at the Indian community there. Just a couple days ago, there were literally militants outside the city hall in Frisco spreading hate about Indians. And they have repeatedly made comments like, we don't want Hindu temples and we don't want your mosques. You know, we don't want Hindus and Muslims here. Those are the kinds of things that they're saying. And our futures and our safety as Hindus and as Muslims is tied up with each other. It's tied up with the Sikh community. And this is something I think it's very important for the Hindu community to recognize, is because often you see some Hindu groups, they try to just focus on just the Hindu community and talk about this concept of Hindu phobia or Hindus are being targeted. But when you say that, it ends up not taking into account that many communities are being targeted by the same people for the same reasons. And
So
what we really, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I wanted to go into the specific question that the Hindu community is facing specifically as well, and I thank you for creating that analysis. But the impact of immigration enforcement is a question we had too. So, has there been an impact specifically on the Hindu community on immigration enforcement, such as revocation of H-1B visas? Has the community felt targeted for that at all?
Yeah, so H-1B visas are, overwhelmingly just a significant number of H-1B visa holders are Indian immigrants. And the Indian immigrants who are in the United States, the majority of them are Hindu. And so, a lot of these H-1B visa holders are Hindu. And so obviously with these changes to the H-1B visa program, from the $100,000 fee that's been attached to new visas to general hate speech that's being directed at people who are on H-1B visas, to most recently, they created a new provision in law which requires you, if you're going to be getting a green card, you need to apply in your home country if you're not on some kind of permanent status already. So these kinds of provisions like make people who are on H-1B visas feel more vulnerable. And a lot of these folks who are on H-1B visas are Hindu. So there is definitely a feeling of being targeted.
So no, that's important to know. And just the last question on this. So does the Hindu community, has it mobilized in a way to respond to these types of targeted policies coming from a place of discrimination against the Hindu community? Or it's not used in that narrative just because the overlap is very clear?
Well, I think it's important to note that if we're facing hate crimes and we're facing issues with immigration enforcement, the main reason that we're being targeted is because of general racism and the anti-immigrant environment.
Okay.
There are definitely times when it's because we're Hindu, so we find it best to ally ourselves with other South Asian groups and fight as South Asians collectively together.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Sravya. Ms. Sravya Sadefali. I'd like to now please invite Ms. Jane Ramsey to join me. Hello, Ms. Jane Ramsey. So interfaith work has been so important in social justice work throughout the history of this country, and especially when there were social justice movements. You prescribe to the Jewish faith. How has the Jewish community traditionally been civically engaged for social justice issues beyond just the issues being faced by the Jewish community?
Yeah, so Maria, thank you so much for raising that question and for convening us. It's very much in the tradition that we prescribe. And just a background, I'm a lecturer at the University of Chicago, Crown School of Social Work. But I'm a longtime Jewish social justice activist and longtime executive director of the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, which is part of the movement. So just a little background. The Jewish community, when it came in the 19th century, started forming organizations around social justice, understanding two things. That one, that as Jews will prescribe justice, justice shalt thou pursue. And the other, that where there is hate and unmet needs directed towards one, it's directed towards all of us, and it's a danger to all of us. So the National Council of Jewish Women was founded in 1893 to fight for the rights of all women, children, and families. The Jewish Labor Committee was founded in the 1930s to fight for worker rights. But many organizations came in all of our traditions, came out of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs was the oldest local Jewish social justice organization of its type, founded to address inequities, racism, and to build bridges between our communities to address practical issues, redlining, school and housing segregation, police torture and misconduct. Over the past century, it's increasingly met that we stand in solidarity with the Muslim community, speaking out against specific incidences and the rising tide of Islamophobia. And over the 60 years that JCUA has existed, it's acted with diverse community organizations to build affordable housing, advocate livable wages, ensure voting rights, be part of the immigrant rights movement, stand at Broadview over the last few weeks, and to stop ICE and DHS abuses, so that the work that JCUA has done, like the work of its sister organizations across the country, Jewish Community Action in Minneapolis, St. Paul has been very much a part of the anti-ICE movement. JFRID, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice in New York, has been very much a part of many movements. As national organizations like Ben the Ark, formerly Jewish Fund for Justice, which prioritizes on its website fighting white supremacy and fascism, and for the first time in its history endorsed a mayoral candidate, now Mayor Farad Mandani. So that I think the history of the local Jewish social justice organizations around the country, going back to the first organizations that were founded, is an understanding both of our necessity to achieve justice and the danger for all of us in our not working to do so. So that's my gratitude to this conversation.
Thank you.
And to everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Jane Ramsey. And I just think it's important to receive that history too, because especially in the past 2-3 years, the headlines and everything that we see as sound bites that the Jewish community is only focused on one aspect of injustice, one aspect of discrimination, and to give a backdrop of the history of the Jewish community's engagement across communities is very critical. I'd like to invite now Professor Joshua Shanes to join me.
Hello.
Well, let me be clear. It's Dr. Joshua Shanes, Professor Dr. Shanes. No, that's not Dr.
Just don't call me late for dinner.
There you go. Okay. All right. Let's see if we see the split screen. Okay, they're working on it, but I'm going to ask you the question. So let's dig in here. It's been an intense time for our nation, specifically on issues of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism across the country. These are conversations being held by policymakers, academics, students on campus. And one thing that's very, very important, which I said earlier when I started, is that you would believe, listening to the media, that a civil discourse is impossible, right? And we are here to recognize that it's not impossible. In fact, we have them all the time. So those who cannot have it should not speak for ourselves. My question to you is, as a professor of Jewish history, what is the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for convening this amazing group of people to learn together. I'm really happy to be here. So let me say, first of all, for anyone listening who wants more resources, I do teach at UC Davis. I'm also a member of a group called the Nexus Foundation, Nexus, like the word. And if you Google Nexus Anti-Semitism, you'll find us very quickly. And there are resources there that you might find very helpful that are dedicated to explaining this relationship between anti-Semitism, Zionism, and anti-Zionism. It's a big topic, which I'm going to have to try to summarize in 120 seconds, so I'll try to do that. Anti-Semitism is the modern term used. It was coined in the 1870s to refer to an ideology of hatred towards the Jews, or a manifestation of that hatred, whether it's legal, social discrimination, violence, or any other aspect. It has a lot of features and it manifests in a lot of ways. But in the modern world, the easiest way to grasp it is that it's based on the notion of a kind of conspiracy theory that global Jews constitute a single entity who are nefariously trying to work to undermine the nation state, to undermine the prosperity of other people, maybe even to destroy the world itself. You want to think about your science fiction. If you like Star Trek: The Next Generation, think about the Borg. If you like Stranger Things, think about the monster that lives in the Upside Down. That it's all a single hive mind. And so if you see any kind of conspiracy theory that thinks about Jews in this way, this is where you're going to see sort of the heart of modern anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean that the old Christian ideas of Jews, denying Jesus's messiahship, or Jews, blood libel, that Jews, kill children for their blood. These things kick around, but those are more pre-modern things that are still kicking around rather than the heart and soul of modern anti-Semitism. Zionism, to understand anti-Zionism, you have to, what is anti-Zionism opposing? Right? It's anti-Zionism. So what is it opposing? So there's two aspects to Zionism. One aspect of Zionism is this movement for a Jewish state in Palestine, what Jews call the land of Israel, and everything that's being done in that land, right? Everything that happened before and since Israel was founded. That's Zionism being enacted. But for a lot of people, especially in the United States and elsewhere in the Jewish diaspora, Zionism is a vague kind of ethnic pride, a vague kind of Jewishness that really isn't even especially connected to what Israel is doing, not directly in any case. It's more of an identity. It's more of a kind of secular form of Jewishness. And so anti-Zionism, we should think of it in terms of the state, right? So when people come to me and say, I want to protest Israel, I want to protest Israel vociferously, and in good faith, I really don't want to be anti-Semitic like everybody is accusing me. How do I do that? And my answer is always to focus on the state. If you're focusing on Zionism being enacted in the state of Israel, everything that it's doing in that land, Israel, Palestine, between the river and the sea and beyond, then that's perfectly fine. If you're dealing with a conspiracy theory, right, and that could manifest either Israel is instead of saying, there is this super billionaire Jew that controls the world, like the Rothschild family or George Soros, you say Israel controls the world. Israel runs Washington, D.C. and Moscow and London. That's not really anti-Zionism. It's not anti-Israelism for sure, right? That's some sort of modern conspiracy theory. And instead of saying Rothschild, you're saying Israel. Or on the flip side, if you find some random Jew in Chicago or Urbana or wherever you find them and say, oh, this is a Jewish person, they're probably Zionist, maybe I know they're Zionist. Therefore, they're responsible for what Israel does, because after all, it's just one big monster, just like the monster in Stranger Things. That would also be anti-Semitism. So the distinction between the two is, if you're focusing on a concept of a global Jewry that's out there to nefariously destroy the world, that is anti-Semitism. If you're focused on Israel and what Israel is doing in the land that Israel actually controls, that is anti-Zionism, and those two things are quite distinct.
Okay, thank you. We're going to dig deeper into this and bring a few people to unpack this. Thank you so much for the distinction. I'd like to invite Miss Arshia Ali Khan, please, to join me. Okay, so you may just be hearing me, everybody, but it's you guys are the stars here, so we want to be able to hear from you and see you. So, Ms. Arshia Ali Khan, if you can just introduce your position really quick, and then I'll ask you my question.
Assalamu alaikum, Maria, and assalamu alaikum, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me in this beautiful conversation. My name is Arshia Ali Khan, and I'm the CEO of the Muslim Legal Fund of America, and the national full-service 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to protecting civil liberties and constitutional rights of American Muslims and Muslim institutions through federal litigation, legal education, and nonprofit governance risk compliance.
Thank you. So we just got a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I know that you work with a lot of individuals who have been penalized for not seeing the difference or recognizing the difference the way Professor Joshua Shanes does. And something that people don't know a lot about and want to learn about is the Esther Project. And I think your organization works with a lot of people that are involved in that process. So can you please share with the audience what that is so we can understand better?
Of course, absolutely. So Project Esther is a policy blueprint released by the Heritage Foundation in 2024, a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism. For those of you who are not familiar with the Heritage Foundation, it's best known as Developing Project 2025. So Project Esther argues that rising anti-Semitism is not only a result of individual acts of hate, but it is connected to a broader network of organizations, activists, student groups, institutions, that it refers to as the Hamas Support Network. The plan then outlines a coordinated strategy involving government agencies, universities, nonprofits, donors, immigration authorities, and other institutions to respond to what it views as a threat. Supporters of Project Esther view this as a necessary response to the rising anti-Semitism and believe that stronger action is needed to protect the Jewish community. Whereas critics argue that the risk of blurring the important distinction between anti-Semitism, criticism of the Israeli government, advocacy for Palestinian rights, student activism, and the support for terrorism, From a civil liberties perspective, those distinctions matter. Criticism of a government, advocacy for a political cause, protest, or dissent cannot automatically be treated as support for terrorism. In a constitutional democracy, we must be careful not to blur the line between unlawful conduct and protected speech. For me, the debate is not whether anti-Semitism should be addressed. Anti-Semitism is real, it's dangerous, and it must be confronted. Jewish communities deserve safety and dignity and protection, but so does every other faith community. The deeper question that I ask is, how do we address it? Can we confront hatred while preserving the constitutional freedoms that protect all Americans? As someone who works in civil liberties, and my position is straightforward. We must fight anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hate, i.e. Islamophobia, anti-Sikh hate, anti-Hindu hate, all forms of religious discrimination. We must do so in a way that preserves free speech, religious liberty, due process, and equal protection under the law. So I'll end with this. The Constitution does not require us to choose safety and liberty. In fact, it challenges us to protect both. And history teaches us that when constitutional protections are weakened for any community, they're weakened for every community.
Thank you, Ms. Arshia Ali Khan. I'd like to invite Ms. Samira Al-Hosri to join me to expound a little bit on the litigation matter that you touched upon. So I understand that the Muslim Legal Fund of America has dealt with a lot of cases and that tied to the Project Esther. But what are maybe you can share an example of a concrete case for the audience, because a lot of people, it doesn't even cross their radar on the news.
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Mariah, for having us. My name is Samira Al-Hosri. I'm the staff attorney in the Civil Litigation Department at the Muslim Legal Fund of America. So Project Esther, as Arshia very clearly stated, encourages using the law, including the Anti-Terrorism Act, to target pro-Palestine speech, which it labels as pro-Hamas speech. These targeted lawsuits are sometimes referred to as lawfare. And we saw the beginnings of this lawfare in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th terrorist attacks, and where there were several plaintiffs in several different lawsuits across the country that brought lawsuits against organizations and individuals who were advocating for Palestine and advocating for justice in Palestine, and at trying to connect them to the terrorist attacks as linking them unfairly as the propaganda arm of Hamas, and trying to hold them responsible for the October 7th terrorist attacks. So those lawsuits have, in the time since they were filed, been largely unsuccessful. Courts have found that many of those plaintiffs failed to support the allegations that they brought, trying to falsely label these organizations and individuals as responsible for terror. So as we've seen those cases start to fall, we've seen in the last sort of year and a half a pivot to lawsuits that are bringing civil rights conspiracy claims, and even in some cases state tort claims such as assault and defamation claims against organizations and individuals for their pro-Palestine speech and pro-Palestine activity. And these claims have had some varying success nationwide, but they are still ongoing or still pending in most cases, since they were mostly brought in the last year or so. And another major change we saw in the last year, and since the Trump administration came into office, is the involvement of the federal government in pursuing actions and using the law to go after pro-Palestine organizations and pro-Palestine speech as well. So that's sort of the layout of the land in terms of lawfare against Palestine speech.
So it has a lot of spokes. We're specifically talking about it. It sounds like you're specifically talking about Palestinians, but you're talking about individuals that could also be pro-Palestinian. So they could be Jewish that are pro-Palestinian, somebody else that could be pro-Palestinian. So terminology matters a lot too. I'd like to now ask you. You talked about federal funding. What we also saw was federal funding being used with universities and policies. I'd like to invite back Dr. Joshua Shanes, please. So,
please.
Yeah, so what we witnessed, I don't know if we're going to get the split screen, but I'm afraid to disappear, so not taking any chances. But we specifically saw congressional hearings where university presidents were invited and summoned, not invited, summoned, and questioned about anti-Semitism on their campuses. And then majority of them are no longer in that position. And as a professor of Jewish history, understanding the values of academic freedom, with your expertise in anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, what is your opinion of how those congressional hearings went, what that message is to the country and academia, the future of academia, and then also the freezing of federal funds in general of universities if you don't follow suits to anti-Semitism policies?
Thank you. Such an important question. Before I begin, I just want to say I agree with everything that Ms. Ali Khan said, but if I can just offer one more resource, if you Google Nexus Project Esther, there's a wonderful explanation of what Project Esther is doing, why it's so problematic, and how Nexus analyzes that. So just to have a quick reference if anyone's interested. Regarding those hearings, I think the presidents, with all due respect to their accomplishment, they didn't understand what was happening, right? They were being led by a Congresswoman, Stefanik, who was really a representative of anti-Semitism, right? She herself promoted the idea of great replacement, that white people are being replaced by non-white people in America, which the heart and soul of that theory is that there's a global Jewish collective that's orchestrating it. That's why in Charlottesville, when the neo-Nazis were marching, they were marching, Jews will not replace us. They didn't mean there's going to be 100 million Jews coming into America. They meant that the global Jewish conspiracy, the puppet makers, they're going to bring in all these non-white people. And she is an advocate of a fear of that and other things as well, not to mention the entire threat of Christian nationalism. So what that entire event was doing was trying to remake anti-Semitism from being what it actually is into being basically equated with any kind of pro-Palestinian advocacy. And that's not to say that in the midst of pro-Palestinian advocacy, there can't be anti-Semitism. Of course there can be. When you have a rally with 1,000 people, there could be anti-Semites who join that rally because it seems to them like they're coming out against Jews, and that sounds great. But they're trying to broad stroke the entire event with that. So instead of responding with a legal answer, trying to defend free speech on campus, which is a very noble and very, very important thing to do, they instead should have highlighted, in my opinion, the problem of the question, right? They shouldn't have accepted the premise of the question, I think was the problem. And this is what kind of, I think, backfired on them in a way that they didn't maybe anticipate. In terms of the universities, the pulling of funds, it's pretty clear to all of us in the universities who work on this project, who work on this problem, I should say, it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. In fact, on the contrary, first of all, we know that this administration and Project 2025, they wanted to gut higher education from the beginning, and they were looking for an excuse to do it. They are pulling funding from Jews. They are pulling funding from non-Jews who therefore get the message. I mean, I can tell you from my own family, somebody was working with somebody in my family who was, I don't remember if they were Christian or Muslim, they were something, not Jewish, and they lost their entire lab. And if it weren't for the fact that they knew my family, that was the only thing keeping them from saying, God, those Jews are costing us our funding. It's scapegoating the Jews for a broader Christian nationalist project. That is extremely dangerous, on top of the danger of the gutting of academia itself. And it is certainly not helping anti-Semitism. It is certainly worsening anti-Semitism. It is spreading the idea that Jews are a global conniving power, nefariously threatening the American people.
So thank you for that analysis. And let me ask you, I know that there's a Canary Mission too. Is Canary Mission connected to Project Esther? And as a professor,
we don't know what they're connected to because, like many McCarthyite groups, they are completely secret. We don't know who's funding them, and almost any of the funding, we don't know who's organizing them. There is no way of contacting anyone behind them. There was a court case in which
I will
hold off on that. Yeah.
Yes, I'm going to hold on to that, but I wanted you to define. No, I wanted you to give me a one opinion, your 2-word opinion on the Canary Mission.
It is a secret McCarthyite group trying to stifle free speech and even get people fired and deported for their political opinions.
Okay, that was more than 2 words, but it did
the
exactly.
best I can do. I'm an academic.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to now invite Mr. Tariq Khalil to join me, please. Assalamu alaikum. So, Mr. Tariq Khalil, we heard about, and you're muted, by the way. We heard about the a short description of the. Now I can hear you. Now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. I said assalamu alaikum. You didn't say it back to me, so I was like, what's going on?
Okay, assalamu alaikum. I bid you peace. I bid all of you peace. We all bid each other peace. Yes. We got a description from Professor Joshua Shanes about the Canary Mission. It's, pretty clear what his opinion is. Now, you are a Muslim Palestinian American living in this country. Can you expound on the Canary Mission and Project Esther and its impact on the Muslim Palestinian community? Because it's like the two are merging with this conversation with you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me again. And just a little bit about me before I move forward with the question. I am the Education Chair with American Muslims for Palestine, which is a grassroots organization dedicated to advancing the movement for justice in Palestine through education, advocacy, and grassroots mobilization. So the fundamental issue with Project Esther and Canary Mission is that they transform constitutionally protected speech into a national security concern and reframe anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and therefore characterizing as anti-Semitic statements that target a system of oppression and domination, i.e. apartheid, and that opposes a brutal military occupation, not to mention the siege and blockade in Gaza and so on, and demanding an end to the genocide and the full implementation of international law. There's a reason why Canary Mission is a secretive body, because its goal is to defame people because they advocate for freedom, justice, and liberation for the Palestinian people. And I want to just piggyback off of something that was said earlier regarding Zionism, because this is at the heart of this whole discussion that we've had just the last few minutes. To properly define a movement, you have to look at three essential elements: the statements and utterances of its founding fathers and leading figures during the formative period of that movement, the practices of those belonging to that movement, and the experience of its victims, i.e., the Palestinians. By that standard, it's quite clear what Zionism actually means, and that's how you can break off and make that distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Zionism is a European nationalist settler colonial project infused with a political mission of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine at the expense, and that's the key point, at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian Arab population. So central to Zionism was the idea of ethnically cleansing the indigenous population, ultimately implemented through massacres and forcibly displacing over 750,000 Palestinians from their home. It is worth noting that Zionism actually began as a Christian project before it became a Jewish one. A number of evangelical Christians in Great Britain supported restoring Jews to Zion, ironically, partly with the anti-Semitic motivation of driving the Jewish population out of Europe and to fulfill the end-time prophecy for the second coming of Christ. So Jewish Zionism was put into concrete practice when Prime Minister at the time, Arthur James Balfour, pushed the 1905 Aliens Act, the aim of which was to stop the immigration of Jews to Great Britain that are fleeing anti-Semitism in Russia. So this illustrates quite clearly that you can actually be a Zionist and also be an anti-Semite. So the founding fathers of Zionism clearly said, we can go from Theodor Herzl on, but for the sake of time, just really briefly. Theodor Herzl said that the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. He wrote in his diaries talking about the sending across the border the indigenous population. Zev Jabotinsky, all the way to the right-wing brand of Zionism. And he's basically the political father of the modern-day leader of the Likud, Benjamin Netanyahu. And he said, quote, Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. To formulate it any other way would be hypocrisy. That is Zionism. Anti-Semitism, on the other hand, is the racialized hatred of the Jewish people. And that's the clear distinction, without having given into any particular examples of, if you say this or say that. That's the clear distinction between the two. Opposition to a European settler colonial nationalist project and a racialized hatred and bigotry towards another people.
So I understand that, and I see the distinction that you're making, and I want to tie it back to the Canary Mission for a second. So this explanation that you gave, now, from what we have seen of the way Canary Mission operates, and it silences people and it targets people for their freedom of speech, is what we have learned. Are you comfortable in current spaces sharing your opinions openly? And does Canary Mission take targets for public statements like the ones that you are making right now? And that's what's really important, because I want to tie it back to our constitutional protection and our protection and our belief in the First Amendment, that we can disagree. A lot of people can disagree here, but the question is, can we, as all people of faith with different understandings and beliefs and different understandings of history, even still believe that you have the right to say what you want to say confidently and safely? So does Canary Mission attack that one fundamental premise?
Yes. Now, fortunately for me, that has not impacted me personally. I am on the Canary Mission.
Okay. What does that mean, actually? Because, this is the biggest reason of why we're having this conversation is like to open this up, right? What does that mean you are on the Canary mission? What does that
It
mean so the
means
audience understands?
it means that I am either, you don't necessarily have to be an academic. Obviously now the main target are students, but lawyers, academics, historians, those that have advocated for Palestinian human rights over time and have infiltrated social media and political spaces and have built some type of reputation for that advocacy, they're the ones that become targets to suppress. The goal is to defame and suppress. Now, fortunately for me, that has not impacted me specifically. And if you actually go to my Canary Mission page, you will see that they don't call me out as an anti-Semite because I'm very careful to not fall into the tropes that was highlighted earlier by Joshua, because those tropes, they lead to nowhere. It does not enhance my argument in any way. It does not move the needle forward towards achieving Palestinian rights and self-determination for the Palestinian people. So they're careful to not characterize me as such. But that's why I try to educate students and others to make sure they craft their language and messaging without getting into these particular tropes. But even if you don't get into these tropes, like I don't, you can still be part of the Canary Mission, because the goal is not to target anti-Semitic behavior. The goal is to target anti-Zionist behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, but there are, now that you just stated, and I think Professor Joshua Shanes would agree with this, that now it's not just targeted to ECA professors. It's moved down to students in like the most important time of their academic career, where they're growing and thriving to be, contributing members of our society. And a lot of them are just unaware of how to protect themselves. But now people are taking action to respond. So I'd like to invite now Mr. Ahmed Rahab to join me. Assalamu alaikum, Ahmed. So, this is a very important conversation about solutions, because one of the major reasons why this town hall is important is that the faith communities are able to see the implications that people face, the issues that are overlapping, and then the solutions and what communities are doing to resolve them. So, from my understanding, there are legal implications and there are legal responses that have been taken for organizations like Canary Mission, and that kind of opens up more of the mystery about this. Can you expound on that?
Assalamu alaikum. Ahmed Rahab, Executive Director of CARE Chicago. Happy to be here with you in this very enlightening and really expansive discussion on these issues. Look, in terms of the solution, it is not giving into fear, because outfits like this are ultimately about instituting fear so that they trigger self-censorship. And if that fails, if you are brave enough and courageous enough and resilient enough to continue to advocate for human rights and for justice, and you don't take the bait, then to punish you by convincing others, maybe your employers or your school or others who have some power over your life, to punish you as someone who's committed a certain sin, typically alleged as anti-Semitism or belonging to being pro-terrorist, pro-Hamas. These are the two things that typically they target students and academics and others through. And so first, you have not to give in to fear, and second, you have to fight for your rights, not to be punished in this manner. And that's what we're doing at CARE Chicago through this lawsuit against Canary Mission, the first of its kind. And one of the reasons why it's the first of its kind is because, as Professor Joshua earlier stated, they're a secretive group that is very shady and very difficult to identify and to pin down. In our research in doing this lawsuit, we found that they have no American feet on the ground. It's purely an Israeli operation. And there's no American board members or addresses or staff. Now, Illinois has a doxing law, and we are suing on this law. Our lawsuit seeks to protect Illinois residents that have been doxed. Doxing means that your personal information has been identified online with the intention to harm you, your place of employment, your place of residence, etc., because of your political opinion. Now, the doxing organizations, their business model is to attack the messenger, as I mentioned, in order to silence the message. And it's become a big business for these organizations because it's worked, mostly because of the cowardice of many, including employers. Our clients are multi-faith, many are Muslim, but they're multi-faith, and they have backgrounds from all over the world. And these organizations are undermining everyone's ability to call out and fight actual anti-Semitism by claiming every tepid criticism of Israel's government as automatically being anti-Semitism. Now, regardless of political opinion, this case is about protecting the free speech really of college students and professors and anybody who's working to speak out for human rights and protecting their current and future employment from organizations seeking to punish, like Canary Mission, but also like Stop Anti-Semitism, which is a more recent X account that does the same, and we're also suing them as well. There's also the Chicago Jewish Alliance, which is another nefarious group that's popped up, and we're suing them as well. Lastly, it is ironic that Canary Mission spends its time and money publicizing the personal information of people speaking out against genocide in order to punish them, while doing everything they can to maintain their secrecy and anonymity. So I found that to be really interesting. I also want to mention, Maria, if I will, just, this is the micro, this is the details, but the larger context of this is really important. And I think, this wonderful platform that you have here, that you've created in this format, needs a part two. And the part two, in my opinion, should focus on Zionism, anti-Semitism, Sharia, Islamophobia, those terms that mean something, but also have become buzzwords that have been abused and misused and expanded and misdefined and redefined in ways that really affect all of these conversations, and they require their own fleshing out, bring Jewish voices, Muslim voices, pro-Zionist, anti-Zionist, whatever, in order to have a real conversation about this. Because I'll just conclude by saying, for us, for example, Zionism is a political ideology, and it's a supremacist political ideology, and it's a violent supremacist political ideology at that, insofar as it has been applied in every Israeli government since its inception, regardless of what it means to the average person who is well above and beyond those governments. That's how it has played out in terms of the genocides and the displacement and the dispossession and the wars in the region that cost us tax dollars and thousands of lives, American lives. And so it plays directly into Canary Mission, because that's what we're opposing. But then the anti-Semitism thing, right? It's expanded to include criticism of Zionism, and therefore you're anti-Semitic if you're involved in critiquing what I just mentioned, which I find to be something worthy of critique. There are many things to say about that, including the fact that I'm a Semite.
But
I find anti-Semitism an interesting term.
I think the biggest thing here is that the terminology and who defines them and why they're defined is critically important. And then policy follows after that. I want to bring in really quickly Miss Megan Goodwin again at this time, because what we're talking about specifically about going after the First Amendment is Megan Goodwin here. Thank you. So I wanted to bring you back in here, as a Catholic American watching how different faith groups have been targeted by different organizations or entities that are known or unknown to restrict their First Amendment. And I think there's a tension sometimes with how strong our democratic values are, right? When there are faith communities and there's democracy, how strong are they? And do they stand up to the test? So I just want to ask you, with Catholicism and democracy, the interplay of that, with the Establishment Clause, but also being centered on the fact that faith is so important to the Catholic community. It guides their civic space, their public space, their private space. How do you define the interplay or the distinction of how they are related?
Thank you, Maria, for the question. And it's a very good one. And when we opened this this online forum, the question about Catholicism is what were the fundamental policy positions? And I started with the policy positions rather than the internal theological commitments of the Catholic tradition, precisely because within the Catholic tradition, there is a strong distinction between the interior beliefs and values, the Christian values of the Catholic Church, and how the Catholic Church sees those values interfacing in a pluralistic democracy, then that those two things can exist side by side. So in terms of Catholicism and democracy, this is the heart of what I work on. So I'll give you a short version of a long argument. The first thing I would say is that the relationship is far deeper and far older than people usually assume. The common story is that the Catholic Church was not so friendly to democracy and only made its peace with it reluctantly in the 20th century. I think that story is wrong. The Catholic tradition supplies many of the very materials that constitutional democracy is built from, long before they were ever institutionalized politically. So let me give you three. First, and this gets to the heart of what is democracy. Democracy is more than elections. A constitutional democracy, what we mean when we say that, encompasses all kinds of institutions, processes, and norms. So first, the rule of law. Catholic Saint Thomas Aquinas held that the ruler is under the law, not above it. So it's the rule of law, not the rule by law, right? So the ruler is under the law, not above it. And an unjust law, he held, is no true law at all. Secondly, the dignity of the human person. Because every person is made in the image of God, no government and no majority may treat that person as disposable, which is exactly the ground of minority rights. And thirdly, the idea that authority comes from community. Saint Robert Bellarmine and Francisco Suarez, two Catholic saints, argued that political power is mediated through the people, so that rulers are accountable to the community that they serve. Now, I want to be careful and precise here. I'm not claiming that Thomas Aquinas was a Democrat or that the medieval church was a constitutional republic. It wasn't. What I'm saying is that the tradition was already wrestling with the goods that democracy protects: limited power, the common good, and dignity of conscience. And in the modern period, the church makes this explicit. In the encyclical Dignitatis Humanae, the Second Vatican Council grounded religious freedom in the dignity of the human person. And in the encyclical Centesimus Annus, 100 years, Pope John Paul II affirmed authentic democracy directly, while also warning that a democracy without a shared moral truth can hollow out into a thinly disguised totalitarianism. So my answer to the question is that Catholicism and democracy are not reluctant partners. The church has both deep theological reasons to support democracy and a real institutional capacity to help sustain it. And I'd argue that democracy needs exactly the kind of moral formation the tradition has always been in the business of providing.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. And I wanted to have you come in and explain that because a lot of different faith groups have a relationship with democracy. But it's identified in a way where some people may question it. So for example, what you had stated that Catholics were before, under attack, and then it's argued that Muslims cannot be in a system of a democratic government because they believe that they don't have to follow the law of the land, which is also incorrect because it's a fundamental Islamic belief to follow the law of the land. So the way you analyze it really has a lot of reflections in other faiths. I wanted to bring in Miss Janae Lewis to join me really quick to just expound on something about the Catholic faith. So one question, there's a question that people have. Most people think that majority of the Catholic faith is Caucasian. Mm-hmm. Okay. So can we just get a snapshot of demographics?
Yes, okay. Absolutely. Yes. So the Catholic denomination has the largest number of adherents of any Christian denomination in the country. So it's larger than any one Protestant denomination. Evangelicals and Southern Baptists are next, and Catholic parishes, there are about 19,000, more than 19,000 Catholic parishes or congregations across the country. And there are about 62 million people who identify as Catholic, and this is according to the 2020 census. Catholics are present all across the country, spread pretty evenly, and the majority of Catholics are white. 54% of people who identify as Catholic identify as white, 36% identify as Hispanic, and only 4% and 2% identify as Asian American and Black, respectively. But 4 in 10 Catholics are immigrants or children of immigrants. So racially, I think it is true that most Catholics are white, but I think there's a lot of diversity in terms of almost half of Catholics in the United States have a very close immigration story. I also think it's important to note that Catholics of color, particularly Black Catholics and Hispanic Catholics, have been in the United States since the founding of the country. So the state of Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony, and there were enslaved Black people in Maryland at the founding of the colony who identified as Roman Catholic. And then, of course, as we know, the country expanded into the Southwest, and the border crossed Mexico, as people say. There were people, Latinx people and Hispanic people, who identified as Catholic. The other piece that I'll say is that Catholics politically are almost half and half. So about 53% of Catholics identify as Republican and 43% of Catholics identify as Democrat. And I think that's really important when we try to prescribe what Catholics believe politically. And our Catholic social teaching gives guidance on a range of issues. And I think that teaching is reflected across both political parties in different ways.
Thank you. So I want to turn our attention to the youth now. So we talked about college campuses, and I want to go a little bit younger now. So when we talk about the youth and we talk about political rhetoric, the Catholic position on demonizing political rhetoric, and I'm going to go actually to all the communities and make these connections, so we can move on to the foreign policy issues. But the dehumanizing rhetoric, when you see it from a Catholic perspective being stated or being used about other faiths, what kind of faith position do you use to interpret or judge that political rhetoric as being correct or incorrect or unjust or just?
So I'm not sure that there's a Catholic position on demonizing rhetoric. I will say so the Catholic faith has restrictions like many religions do. So for example, communion, which we call the Eucharist, it's a particular sacrament. It is an important, if not one of the most important tenets of our faith, is only accessible to Catholics who have participated in other sacramental rites, because those rites ask us to affirm or to pledge that we believe that the Eucharist is actually the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Other Christians do not necessarily believe that, and that was one of the main causes of the Protestant Reformation and schisms in the church throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So there are restrictions in Catholicism. And so some individual churches or some communities practice that in very harsh ways, to say that people can only worship up to a certain limit. People might be denied communion. People might be denied access. Now, I think there are individual Catholics, just like in all religions, who will ascribe supremacist rhetoric, limiting rhetoric, may demonize other religions. But something that hasn't been mentioned today is Catholic social teaching, which developed throughout the 20th century and is an interpretation of a modern application of core tenets of the Catholic faith. This includes things like preferential options for the poor and the most vulnerable in a society, affirming the dignity of every single human being and the human rights of every single human being on the planet. There's a concept called subsidiarity, which is about honoring that the people who are most directly connected to a concern or a problem are the best equipped to address and solve that problem. And I think that when we look at Catholic social teaching and the leadership of other senior Catholic officials interpreting how to apply our faith, the exclusion of others is not there. One particular anecdote that I'll share, which I think is important, So during our Easter season, which is the most important feast day in the Catholic liturgy, celebrating the resurrection of Jesus, there are several services that we have leading up to Easter. And we pray for everyone in the Abrahamic traditions. We pray for every Christian, even if they're not Catholic. We pray for everyone in the world. Every Catholic around the world says these prayers during that season, and praying for the well-being and the safety and the unity of faith. And there's also a very explicit statement in our materials instructing us not to denigrate Jews, for example, for the crucifixion of Jesus. This was alluded to earlier, because that used to be a common rhetoric that led to anti-Semitic practices. So the church has done quite a bit to be explicitly inclusive and respectful of other religions, and also to draw the connections there. But you always have individuals who may take that to an extreme.
Well, I mean, I think the key is why I wanted to bring that up is that you had brought up earlier the fundamental belief in dignity of every human being. And I think that, a lot of people have used weaponizing of faith to perpetuate demonizing or dehumanizing rhetoric against other faith groups or other communities. But if you ask the faith community themselves, the fundamental belief in dignity is always there as one of the tenets. So, nothing is a monolith, of course, but the fundamental beliefs you can look to see where do they really stand on human dignity. I just want to tie this to political rhetoric and how it has some real massive impact on people's lives. I think it's been now 2.5 years where the murder of Odeh Al-Fayyoumi happened, who was a Palestinian Muslim boy, and he was murdered and stabbed 26 times by his neighbor because according to the hearings in the case, that he was specifically hearing a lot about anti-Muslim sentiment. And so he took that rage out on this young boy. And I think it's a fundamental discussion to have, the power of dehumanizing rhetoric, and then what we can do as other faith communities as allies, when we are not the target of that specific instance. How do we step up as allies? And what you're saying with the Catholic faith, it's fundamental in your belief that you pray for all human beings and there's dignity. And so you have to step in. We all step in that case. But the question is really what causes that? What causes that rage of dehumanizing rhetoric? And I wonder I want to ask Ms. Karen Gill in the Sikh community, cases like Odeh Al-Fayyoumi was a lesson for children of all faiths across the country. I met people across the world that knew about his murder. And so what did the Sikh community respond with, and how do you feel about situations like that for the Sikh children who are visibly wear turbans, are by the swimming pool and do, are play and are identified as different? That could be a target of someone who has misinformation, which is what we're trying to counter today. Ms. Karen Gill. And thank you, Janae. Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you, Maria. I think that is definitely an important question, and it's sad to see so many of the faiths be, mischaracterized and misinformation driving people's understanding of who we are and creating fear and real world harm. And SALDEF did a study a couple years back on national Sikh American experiences. And I wanted to share this actually in the previous question that you asked about experiences of Sikhs with bullying and discrimination. 60% of the respondents had experienced bullying, and over 50% had experienced discrimination, whether that's in a workplace or where they live. It is a common experience, particularly because Sikhs are such a visible minority. And I think, again, I would echo with what some of the other participants have said. We are all in this together. There is a lot of rampant anti-immigrant hate out there, anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-religious diversity, which we're seeing more and more. You started off this conversation talking about a group of people who, right now hold a lot of power, that feel that this should not be a nation that has religious diversity, that this is founded on certain principles, and those Christian nationalist principles should be what is the core and basis of all our systems and society and education. And I think we're all here because we see the value in religious diversity. And our traditions and our faith teaches us to respect, those that are different from us, and to, find a way to grow and learn and live in a pluralistic society. So I'm not sure if I answered the original question. The question was about how students experience bullying and hate rhetoric.
Yeah, but you answered it because I mean, the fact is that many kids across the spectrum have experienced, and it's tied to political rhetoric, and it's so important for us to be allies for one another. I do want to actually ask Ms. Tuka Nusairat to also join me, and thank you so much, Ms. Karen Gill. Tuka is there. She is. Yes. So specifically now, there is an understanding that after 9/11, there was such a rise in hate crimes, and there was bullying among children, and very, very dangerous incidents that we thought were no longer happening. But the statistics, according to your research, currently in this climate, what are Muslim children facing as far as the experience and the environment of dehumanizing political rhetoric that we hear?
Yeah, one of the most disturbing ways that we're seeing the cost of this dehumanizing rhetoric is in the lives of Muslim youth and children. So in our 2025 study, we found that nearly half of Muslim families, 47% to be specific, said that they had a child who was bullied because of their faith. And that is consistently higher than any other religious group that we surveyed. And the rate has stayed high and elevated over the years. And what is really troubling is who is doing the bullying. So while most incidents involve other students, 36% involve a teacher or a school official, and others involve a classmate's parent. So when more than a third of these cases involve the adults that we entrust to protect our children, it tells us that this is not just childish playground behavior. It really reflects something that is being modeled and permitted in our wider culture, especially amongst our leaders and policymakers. So when these public figures are using dehumanizing language about Muslims, it's signaling that hostility is acceptable, and children are the first to absorb those consequences. We also see heightened emotional distress amongst Muslims after charged political moments. So for a young person, this is really a direct threat to their sense of safety and belonging.
And thank you so much, Ms. Nusairat. And Ms. Sravia, I wanted to ask you, for the Hindu community and Hindu children, you touched a little bit about the discrimination, especially the cases in Frisco. What about your temples? Are your temples safe? I know when the San Diego shooting happened that there were messages across the country where mosques were, being told how to handle their security, how to beef up security. Are you safe in Hindu temples?
We definitely experience challenges such as vandalism is not uncommon at Hindu temples. That being said, the attacks we haven't faced attacks in the same way that the Muslim community and the Sikh community have. There have been some incidents, for example, like the temple at in one of my friends' communities, some teenagers went in and we have murtis or statues of gods, and they went in and broke all the heads of the statues.
Oh,
So
okay.
those kinds of things do happen. But we, fortunately haven't had an incident like what happened in San Diego.
Well, but what you're describing is so important for the audience to hear, because when a community is attacked and children are attacked or a place of worship is attacked, the immediate feeling for that faith community is that they're alone, that it's isolated and they're alone. But the fact is, many communities experience that kind of horror, that they're being confronted with hate for being the other, which is not the case, of course, in this country. So I want to really quickly, before we go to foreign policy, I want to go to Rabbi London to speak, because we do know about the threat to mosques. Is there still a threat to synagogues across the country? And has there been partnership between mosques and synagogues, Muslim and Jewish communities? Because we read those stories in the news of helping each other to kind of address these types of fears.
Yes, there are ongoing threats, and a lot of it has to do with Jews being perceived as supporting the Israeli government, and that being a legitimate excuse to attack Jewish institutions. And whether or not Jews within those institutions support the actions of a government, it's still not a legitimate target to target a synagogue. So I just want to make that really clear. And of course, there was the synagogue in the Detroit area that was attacked because it was perceived as supporting the state of Israel. And the man who attacked it, his brother had been killed in Lebanon, and in his rage and grief, he took this out on the synagogue, and as other people have mentioned, ran into the synagogue where there was a preschool of kids that were there. So I think it's very important that we also say that Jewish institutions are not targets for violence, even if they have some connection to, or even if they're supporting in some way the state of Israel. It doesn't make them a legitimate target. So I think that's very, very important for us to mark that. And I would assume most people here would probably agree with that. And yes, I mean, Jewish institutions are much more fearful. We have a lot more security at our congregation than we've ever had. People have to check in when they come into the door. There are many synagogues now that have metal detectors that are up because of that fear. Certainly, in our community, we have seen our Muslim and our Christian neighbors have stood with us when there have been threats to the Jewish community. As has in my town of Evanston, the Evanston Police Force has been also certainly very supportive and helpful. My colleague and friend Ahmed Rahab, who's on this call, has stood by the Jewish community over many years. We've now worked together more than 20 years, and we've tried to do the same. Certainly, there's been some tensions within the communities based on political differences, but I think that we are all very clear that hatred and violence against religious community is not acceptable, no matter who it is, and that we all need to stand together, that hatred of anybody can lead to hatred of all of us, and that's very important. And I think all of our panelists have really spoken about that, about the importance of our standing together against hate in all of its forms and all of its manifestations.
Thank you. Thank you. So a very significant foreign policy issue that has been in the country is kind of an overlap. It's been brought up earlier here, and that is the policy issue of Gaza, and where faith and the definition of what has happened in Gaza intersect, and the positions that faith communities have taken has divided together or created allyship. So I think it would be right to invite Mr. Tariq Khalil to kind of expound on that, because nobody is a monolith. The Jewish community is not a monolith on this either, and we want to break that open as well. So if Mr. Tariq Khalil can please join me again. And I think he touched on this a little bit, I wanted to give you a moment to expound a little bit if you needed to here. What is from your perspective as a Palestinian Muslim, how does your faith inform your position on Gaza, not just as a Palestinian, but also a person of faith?
With one word, justice. And the Palestinians worldwide, all 13 million plus Palestinians worldwide, are living under an apartheid regime. Now, that may sound a little strange because not all Palestinians live within historic Palestine, but the system of apartheid impacts Palestinian refugees and Palestinians in the diaspora. But no group, no domain of Palestinian existence has experienced the brunt of Israel's apartheid system like our brothers and sisters in Gaza. Just to give a little bit of context on this, because it seems like now the departure point of analysis is always October 7th and after. And we need to understand what October 6th represented. And there's 77 plus years of history that we need to understand, and we can even go further back, but at least that portion needs to be understood for us to provide the proper context. The height of the Nakba period, the catastrophe from 1947 to 1949, established Gaza's contemporary reality and has since been a key space for Israel's displacement policies. So, as I mentioned earlier, the 750,000 Palestinians that were ethnically cleansed from 47 to 49, 200,000 of that number became refugees in the 365-kilometer Gaza Strip, nearly tripling its population. That is why over 70% of the population in Gaza today are refugees from 1948. The Nakba, or setback, in 1967 created yet another refugee crisis wherein 300,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, 40,000 of whom were driven into Gaza. In the 1970s, Israel implemented more direct forms of confinement and immobility on Gazans, and in 1971, Israel erected a barrier to tighten its grip on Gaza, and this was fortified again in 1996 with barbed wire and corrugated sheet metal during the heyday of the so-called peace process. Israel withdrew, and I put that in quotes, from Gaza in 2005 because that did not end the occupation. Instead, that intensified the occupation. In 2007, Gaza was declared hostile territory and imposed a full siege and blockade that is still in place today. The occupation never ended, and this has been affirmed by the ICJ. Israel still controls. I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead. I wanted to round out that, because I'm going to bring you back on this, but I wanted to round out that that your understanding as a Muslim Palestinian, you want to make it very clear that the occupation has never ended and that it is an occupation. And I want to make sure that that statement is conclusive and clear as a representation of your position. I want to ask you specifically, we talked about the Canary Mission. I'm going to ask you again. Other Muslims that have stated this position as you do have had cases of discrimination against them as well, and silencing. What, as a Palestinian Muslim, continues to inspire you to continue to speak this again and again? Why is it so important?
I think it's more so important for the fact that as an American civic, as a civic in this country, as a citizen, my tax dollars are going to fund the first ever live streamed genocide in our history. My tax dollars is going to an entity, to a foreign entity that is continually occupying my people, that is practicing a system of apartheid against my people, is denying my people the right to return to their homes, the right to repatriation, compensation, restitution, and satisfaction. That is at the core of this. And not just as a Muslim American, but as an American, we should not want our tax money to go towards this, because, that makes us contributors to the genocide. We're not complicit, but we're definitely contributors.
Yeah. So let me bring in, because I'm going to bring in the question about the Jewish community being a monolith on the issue of Gaza. I want to bring in really quickly Rabbi London, because I want you to share your faith-based perspective on and how you kind of ease that tension here, right? To coexist and be in this discourse. For example, you had stated very clearly that you and Mr. Ahmed Rahab, the Muslim and Jewish community, have worked together for so long. Mr. Ahmed Rahab has specifically talked about being Muslim and having a position on Gaza, but both of you have had a working relationship. How do you then respond with a person of faith who's Muslim and Palestinian who has this position? How do you engage, and what would your response be, and how do you find that middle ground to continue the discourse? It's difficult. I understand it's difficult, but I understand it's difficult for both sides, but it's so important for everyone that's younger and watching to be able to know the possibility, right?
It's listen, I believe very strongly that the occupation has continued and the occupation needs to end. I also believe very strongly that there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians that live between the river and the sea, and that all of them need to find some way to be able to live peacefully and equitably and with dignity in that land, and that's what we need to be working on. And the question is, how do we get from point A to point B? I happen to agree with Tarek that I don't think that our government should be funding the Israeli military. I agree with that statement. I think there should be greater pressure that's put on Israel as the stronger party to have to make some significant changes. I believe that wholeheartedly, so I do want to make that clear. That would put me in my community to the left. There are people much more centrist and certainly further to the right in my community. We're a diverse community in that kind of way. I get attacked from all sides. I get attacked from the right in my community. I get attacked from the left in the Muslim and Palestinian community as well for not being too far in that direction as well. It's a complicated issue, and I think that we can have in thoughtful ways a conversation about how to get from one point to the next. But I certainly am in agreement that the situation that we're in is abhorrent and highly problematic, and we need, and the American people who do, and the American government that does have a profound impact on everything that happens in the region, to be able to exercise our voice here in our government, because I do believe that our government will have the biggest impact on what is happening in the Middle East as it has in the past.
Thank you. And I want to bring in Mr. Marty Levine, because this expounds on this false notion that we are monoliths as faith communities. You have been I believe, the CEO of the JCC Center of Greater Chicago for over 40 years. You're really someone that's so well known in the Jewish community. And you had positions also, within your faith community. You had positions that you had taken on Gaza. And I think it would be interesting to hear how you have understood to be have understood to see that the Jewish community is quite diverse in this position, right? I mean, it's not a monolith. Can you expound on that and how you've addressed that in your own life and position?
Maria, thank you. This has been a fascinating evening, and I appreciate your setting it up. And to some extent, I'm not used to being as silent for 2 hours. So you've taught me another lesson this evening. Thank you. As the person who led JCC Chicago, the reality of diversity of Jewish life was for me always the big challenge. And one of the perspectives that this evening actually is illustrated is that within the Christian world, there is great diversity, and you see it in all of the organized church streams. Judaism has always been a people, a religion of diversity, in fact, of really heated argument over what Judaism is. We have a tradition that I value that recognizes that people disagree about the very tenets of the faith, elu ve'elu, these and those. And that tradition was so strong that the person who made space for argument in the community was actually the one to be honored, even if he was ultimately the winner of an argument. He was honored for making space. We've lost that in the Jewish community, from my perspective. And at least my observation of the American experience is that happened within Jewish life as Israel became more and more centric to many Jews, as a legacy of the Holocaust, as a reaction to a fear of another Holocaust coming, parts of the Jewish community began to feed on that. And you've seen it tonight in the explanations of struggling to make a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The major proponents of merging those together have come from portions of the Jewish community. They have not come from the outside. And they have come to do that because as Israel has become more and more problematic in its behavior, as the reality of Israel and Palestinian life has become clearer, parts of the Jewish community saw support for Israel eroding, and it brought in a new weapon, anti-Semitism, because that's sort of the trump card in an argument. Those are organizations who claim to speak for all Jews. I've been in too many meetings in the last year where voices I vehemently disagree with have stood up and said, we speak for the Jewish community. No one speaks for all Jews. I advocate alongside Tariq in the name of Jewish Voice for Peace. He and I would agree very clearly. Rabbi London and I agree in some parts, but often don't agree. The difficult part in this political moment is the power of organized Jewish money and organized Jewish established organizations has sought to drive the diversity of Jewish thought off the public consciousness. And so this evening, hopefully, can set a tone that many of us can begin to talk to each other about where we differ. The Jewish community may all agree that anti-Semitism is a threat. I don't disagree with that at all. But we even argue within the Jewish community, as you heard this evening, over the definition of anti-Semitism. So the Nexus Project, which Professor Shanis talks about, is put up in competition by many Jewish organizations with the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, which is put up in conflict with another definition which came out of the Jerusalem conclave, all of whom agree acting on Jews as Jews is anti-Semitic, but they disagree about Israel. They disagree about whether Tariq in his vehemence is an anti-Semite. And we as a community don't agree on that. And maybe the most important lesson to come out of tonight is that Jews are not one voice. We argue with each other, we argue vehemently. Unfortunately, the political arena has been dominated by those who have claimed to speak for the community. Polls show clearly 30–40% of the Jewish community has great problems with the Israeli government, struggles with Zionism as a political philosophy, would agree with many of the critics. And if I have anything to add to tonight's discussion, it is to say that this old head sits with many young voices who think Israel as it sits today is an apartheid state. Will all Jews agree with me? No. Are there parts of the Jewish community that want to put me on their canary mission? Yes. That's Jewish life. It's always been Jewish life. And I came across a quote from the 30s about pogroms in which people who questioned the roots of anti-Semitism within the Jewish community were being attacked as vehemently as some of us are being attacked today. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you. No, thank you, Mr. Levine. I want to tie into, and thank you for your patience, by the way. I want to tie into the policies that are tied to immigration as well with this discussion, because we can't separate the two. So I want to bring in Mr. Kalman Resnick, if he could join me, please, because we have to connect the dots here. So we talked about the anti-Semitism campaign. We talked about Project Esther, University. We learned a lot. But now we really need what we see with immigration and ICE and detention centers. That in itself is a discussion on its own. And I will ask that question too. But to round this out, your experience, you prescribe to the Jewish faith, and your experience as you're watching ICE enforcement that is supposed to be used to keep our country safe from dangerous criminals coming from different parts of the world. How have you seen it used and enforced in this specific instance for this foreign policy question that's in front of us, which is Gaza?
Well, first, let me start by saying I was raised by a wonderful grandmother who grew up in the Ottoman Empire and raised me with always to have respect for Islam, and told me the stories of their relationship with their Muslim neighbors. That may explain why I'm a member of 2 synagogues in the Chicago area, a leader in the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, and a member of the advisory board for CARE Chicago. And I see no contradiction between my Jewish religion and my support for justice for the Palestinian people. Now, I'm an immigrant rights lawyer, and I have defended Palestinian Americans and Muslim Americans who are suffering from the attacks of ICE in Chicago and other cities. There are many Jewish attorneys and a number of Jewish organizations involved in the defense of our Palestinian neighbors, our Muslim neighbors. And there's a good example of that right now because significant portions of the Milwaukee Jewish community is involved in the defense of Salah Sarsour, who is a Palestinian American, who's been leader in the Muslim community, a leader in the Palestinian community, who's now in ICE detention, facing possible deportation. And a significant number of Jews in Milwaukee and Chicago are involved, including organizations like Bend the Arc, a Jewish Voice for Peace, who are organizing to defend Mr. Sarsour. And there'll be a demonstration on June 14th at the Indiana detention facility where he's being held, organized by Jews to bring a Jewish voice to the protests of the efforts to deport him. At the same time, we need to recognize there are organizations like Canary Mission that are targeting Palestinians and the supporters of justice for Palestine for deportation. And I can say as a defender of the Palestinian Americans and their supporters that the best indicator of when the government will detain a person because of their use of their free speech to support the Palestinian cause is whether organizations like Canary Mission identify to the Trump administration that person to be targeted. And I know that based on my representation of a large number of Palestinians who have been facing these issues. But I think there's some more danger that we need to talk about. There's funding by portions of the Jewish establishment of Islamophobia. Organizations like the Jewish Federation of Chicago and other Jewish federations, not all, but many, have provided funding for Islamophobia. And then we have the role of organizations like the Anti-Defamation League in fomenting Islamophobia. And we see numbers of examples of that with regard to the Mayor Mamdani and the attacks on him. So this is complicated. I want to add to what Marty talked about that I don't think we need to look also at the role of Christian nationalists and the Christian nationalist supporters of MAGA in fomenting the attacks upon Palestinian Americans, Palestinian community, the Muslim community. And it's not just the Jewish community involved in this. We have, in fact, as more and more Jews are opposing what Israel is, we see for Israel, an important source of support is the Christian community, the portions of the evangelical community, And that is critical to understand because as Jews in America move away from support for Israel, the role of the Christian right wing, Christian nationalism in supporting Israel is very important and needs to be recognized.
So when we're talking about policies and how it affects, policies that are local that are affecting policies that are foreign, we have the role of what we're using ICE for. So that has come to light that ICE is being used for certain things. There's also I know that there is a policy in Illinois. I'm frozen, I guess. Hold on. Policy in Illinois, specifically using the method of BDS, and that is something that a lot of faith communities are starting to understand or use, but there's still a lot of misinformation about BDS. And I wanted to bring in Tariq Khalil, and I'll ask you too, Mr. Coleman-Reskig, to weigh in on that. Mr. Tariq Khalil, I don't know if he's there right now, but okay, let me ask you, Mr. Coleman-Resnick, do you consider the BDS movement anti-Semitic? Because that is a description that people have used, and can you please share your opinion? Then I'll go to
my opinion, absolutely, it is not anti-Semitic.
Okay.
It's a legitimate, nonviolent form of protest to build international pressure on Israel to end the occupation and achieve justice for the Palestinian people. I view it the way I support BDS, and as a young man, I supported the BDS movement to end South African apartheid, and I support BDS to end apartheid in Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. So let me, I'm going to add this last question about immigration, and then we'll end with our final question, because all of you have been, so engaged, and I thank you. This question about the enforcement methods of immigration. It's one thing to have an opinion on immigration policy, but it's another thing to view what we have seen, all of us have seen on our social media reels of the method of enforcement. And I wanted to bring in Ms. Jana Lewis about immigration and really the Catholic perspective on detention centers, the methodology, of due process, and just the centering of humanity as U.S. policy on immigration, centering humanity in the enforcement of immigration. If you were to speak from your position as a person of faith and how you would address this, what would your position be?
Absolutely. I think it's very simple. The level of violence and abduction and, quite frankly, terror against immigrants and perceived immigrants is completely antithetical to the teachings of Jesus and to Catholic social teaching. So earlier I laid out Catholic social teaching. I talked about the assertion that every human being has dignity. What we see happening of not only people being abducted, children being targeted in schools, children being used as bait in order to target their parents to be arrested. That is a clear violation. But the conditions inside of detention centers as well as jails, which are not as visible to us, are also a clear violation of international human rights. No, they're detention centers that lack clean restroom facilities. Food is moldy. People are literally dying or suffering from medical conditions without medical care. And elected officials who are doing their job trying to see the conditions inside of facilities, like we saw in New Jersey this week, are being attacked by law enforcement and vilified. In addition to that, people's religious rights are being violated because people are not, faith leaders are not able to gain access consistently to help people practice their religions. So it is very, very clear that these conditions violate international human rights law, violate the tenets and the assertions of Catholicism, violate the teachings of Jesus. I also will add, if we look at Jesus's ministry, if we look at the gospel, in the Bible, Jesus repeatedly talked about not only welcoming the stranger, loving the stranger, which was a part of his Jewish tradition, but he also venerated and used the outcast or the stranger or the other as an example of someone we should emulate. The Good Samaritan is a story of someone who is outside of the highest echelon of society that we should emulate. There were women who were considered unclean, identified as someone that we should emulate to be good Christians. And so Jesus was very clear about how we should treat people who we perceive to be outsiders and the other. And this is a clear violation of our values.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Janae Lewis. I'm going to ask the final question now, and I get to pick because I get to pick who gets to answer it from each community because it's kind of that last rounding question, and I wanted to leave it open to being engaged. But all of you have been so tremendous in educating us and really charting a way forward of how to resolve these issues and discuss these issues in nuance, which our country needs so much in implementing proper policy. I started this earlier before I asked my last question that we need to show a model to the nation of civil discourse in some of the most divisive, tensest discussions to be able to create policy because we're actually dealing with human beings. We're dealing with humanity. And so we owe it to humanity to be able to take the time to have this discussion and then educate our elected officials and inform the media to not create false narratives about communities and make good policies based on what the communities are saying. So I appreciate all of you. I'm going to start out with Professor Joshua Shanes first to answer this question. Do you believe in this moment right now that our First Amendment freedom of speech and the freedom to practice our faith are safe and protected? What is your opinion?
Thank you. Boy, that's a great question. I don't want to catastrophize and exaggerate. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I am concerned, and I'm concerned from a couple directions. One direction is the suppression of free speech happening so widely, and really happening in one direction, right? And for very clear political purposes. So I'm very concerned about that. I'm equally concerned about the proliferation of guns and gun violence, and the fact that the First Amendment and the way the Second Amendment has been interpreted are in conflict with each other. I don't, that's something probably a lot of people in this call agree with, but it's something we haven't talked about once. And actually, it's as important or more so than many of the things we have talked about in practice on the ground. In general, we've been talking about two things tonight. One of them is the importance of free speech and really pushing back the importance of dialogue. Not everybody on this call agree with everything that was said. I'm sure of that. Rabbi London made that clear in a very good way, and I agree completely with her. But we've all shown that we can do that, and that it's valuable to do that. At the same time, there have been some people mentioning that rhetoric can be is words are not just words. That rhetoric can be something that can be damaging, and so we struggle with that balance as a society. It goes all the way back to Hobbes, right? We've been struggling with this for centuries, but until recently, with a few, we have sort of had a consensus that incidents like the Red Scare, incidents like McCarthyism, these things were bad, and that we're best served by preserving free speech, even when we don't like the speech that we're hearing. And so at the moment, I'm concerned about the ability to speak freely, and I'm concerned about the ability to practice religion freely. And I would just urge us to think about these issues in a very intersectional kind of way. I don't just mean in terms of Muslims and Jews and Christians and Sikh and so on. Obviously, their intersectionality is vital. But also in terms of the causes of what threatens our ability to speak and pray and practice freely.
Thank you. And I wanna actually tie this, if I can get a snapshot before I ask the same question to somebody else. I want to get a snapshot of how on the ground how dangerous it has been when your First Amendment is violated. Kate Brady, if I can just ask you to join us, and I know it's late and we're closing now. But if you could share, and thank you so much for being patient, but I know that you have a client that depends so much on you and your work. You're a lawyer with the Muslim Legal Fund of America. If you could just give us a snapshot so people understand the First Amendment and how it can affect your presence, and you can be targeted by ICE. You have a client, if you can share his name and just a few sentences.
Yes, thank you. Kelman actually mentioned him, Salah Sarsour. He's
yes.
one of our recent clients. We've had other ones. I mean, just the ICE enforcement really in the last 2.5 years, we've seen for the last 25 at MLFA, people who are Palestinian, such as Salah, who's from the West Bank, and others whose First Amendment and religious rights are really being attacked by ICE very specifically in an effort to silence them, and making very, outrageous and almost the things that they will say, as far as like trying to tie them, as some of the other speakers have said about terrorism, for things that are just living life as a Muslim. I think that it's really outrageous, and I think we saw the high-profile arrest last year, and the fact that those happened during Ramadan, and as people were coming and going from iftar dinners and gatherings, just really, I think, saw the cruelty that goes after what happens when we vilify specific groups for their speech, for defending themselves, their families, their neighbors. These are people who intimately know people who are suffering. I have clients who have had over 100 family members killed in Gaza, and it's not just something that is abstract. It's very personal. And I know that immigration enforcement is necessary in a civil society, but that does not mean that we have to take away the constitutional rights of religious freedom and free speech, especially when it means that you're taking away people's opportunity to identify who they are as a Palestinian, as a Muslim. Those things should not be evidence that is used against them in deportation, as it is against our clients, Salah Sarsour, and some of the other ones that we've had over the last year. Another one who's lived in Chicago, Ayman Solomon, and here in Dallas, Texas, where I am, Marwan Maroof. And these are just people who your heart breaks when you see these good people being treated as if they are not the honest and people of integrity that they are, solely for the purpose of DHS attacking them for their beliefs.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for showing the humanity beyond the little blurbs and headlines that we see that can assassinate character, which is also a methodology of rhetoric. Thank you so much, Kate Brady. And I'd like to ask Ms. Megan Goodwin, as a Catholic American, do you feel that your First Amendment is safe and protected, and your ability to practice your faith is protected, or not just yours, but everybody's in this country? And what can we ensure as people of faith and as we live in a democracy? How can we ensure that they remain protected?
Thank you. I want to close with gratitude and then an honest answer to the question you've put to me. So first, gratitude. Look at what happened in this room tonight. People of different faiths sat at one virtual table, and we talked about the hardest things there are. We talked about violence, Gaza, deportation, the safety of our children. And we did it without once, that I heard, reducing each other to a caricature. And that's not a small thing. That is the model. The country is starving for proof that we can disagree about everything and still refuse to dehumanize anyone. And tonight, for the past couple of hours, we were that proof. And we owe that to one another, and we owe it to a nation that is being taught daily that the person who's different from you is your enemy. Which is why the point that you raised about the media and the media who are here tonight matters so much. The threat to our common life is rarely honest disagreement. It's the false narrative, the story that flattens the whole person into a single ugly word. And we have a duty to refuse those narratives and to refuse to profit from them. So to your question, do I believe our First Amendment protections, including religious freedom, are being protected? And my answer is, on paper, yes. And that paper is one of the great achievements of human governance. The protections are real and they're strong, but a right is not only a clause in a document. It's something a person has to be able to actually live. And by that measure, I am worried. The Catholic bishops themselves have named attacks on houses of worship as among the gravest threats to religious liberty in this country. And they meant every house of worship, the synagogue and the mosque and the temple alongside the church. We have watched immigration enforcement reach to the sanctuary. We have people who are afraid to go to church because of immigration enforcement. In Washington, D.C. alone, the Spanish mass attendance has dropped by over a third. People are afraid to go. The sensitive locations decision, which removed the previously standing rule that ICE would not come into sacred or sensitive spaces, that's gone. So legally, they've determined, come into a house of worship and detain people. So fear is doing what no law ever could. And that's what concerns me. So here's what I've come to believe. A freedom written on paper is either kept alive or allowed to die in the culture that surrounds it. The First Amendment can't protect us from our own contempt within this country. No court order can order us to see the image of God in the stranger. Which means that the protection of religious freedom is not finally only the work of judges, it's the work of neighbors. It is faith communities standing with one another at each other's doors so that an attack on your altar is treated like an attack on mine. That is the freedom that no government can grant and none can take away. And it's the one that we are each responsible for tonight, tomorrow, and after this call is over. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Goodwin. I think that is a beautiful closing statement, to be honest with you. I appreciate your words. I want to thank all of the participants for taking the time, for understanding the value of speaking together in a way that is uplifts humanity, uplifts each other's dignity. I hope that this is a model for the nation, and I hope that this is a model for what is possible for a younger generation and for all of us right now. I think it's very important for everyone that's watching and will watch this to understand the impact of ordinary people that are not in elected positions, the amount of power and impact we can have to be able to change domestic and foreign policy. We have to be able to put ourselves in positions where we can provide information to the decision makers, and we have to see ourselves as partners. We can't be recipients of bad decisions. We have to take accountability when decisions are bad for being apathetic. This group here and many across the nation have decided not to be apathetic. And I would applaud them and encourage them to continue to be engaged. And I just want to end by saying that the possibility is so inspiring. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us. And I want every one of you in the audience to also recognize that it is just a matter of an email or a phone call to your congressional representatives to share with them your vision and your value of our multi-faith nation that respects the Constitution and respects the dignity of humanity. We see them as core values as people of faith. And we also see every individual with faith or without faith to have the right to live with dignity. And I want to close with that. And I want to thank all of you for your expertise and your sincerity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Maria,
you.
thank you for putting this together.
Yes, thank you, Mario.
I'm going to definitely use your